Hello and welcome. This is Lights Out, and away we go with the episode. With the Formula One podcast for fans, by fans. And I'm Will, and as I look across the digital garage, as always, I'm joined by my co-host or co-driver, Sam. Hello, Sam. How are you doing?
Hello, Will. Hello, listeners. I'm very well, thanks. Pleasure to be back on the pod with you again. How are you?
Yes, I'm all good, thank you. I had a choir concert yesterday, so I think the voice is a bit tired, so I'm a bit deeper, I think, maybe today. So enjoy these dulcet baritone lower tones that you're getting today.
I will. How did it go?
It was very good, yeah. Some lovely singing by all. I had a lovely ABBA mega mix. Shout out to the choir I was in, Choir Co. It was good fun. First time I've ever done a cappella, so it was nice to try something a bit different. I was singing the bass part, so it was just a lot of me going dum 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 dum, like so. Yeah. Didn't get to sing many actual words in the ABBA mega mix, but still enjoyed it. Still good fun. Did you have a good weekend?
I did. Nothing as exciting as that.
Sad.
No singing on my part. I was pretty busy with Junior. We went out, did a couple of walks. Then I watched the football, sadly, on Sunday, which didn't go particularly well. For me personally, I'm sure it went well for lots of others out there. But that was kind of it.
Did Arsenal lose?
What do you mean, did Arsenal lose? you know very well they did. I saw your peevish little grin as you asked that question.
I had to get it in there.
Yes, they lost. It didn't go well, but never mind.
Oh well. At least if with the football season almost ending, at least you got another 18, 19, 17 races of the Formula One season to go, and hopefully a better F1 season than hopefully it gets better than the Arsenal season's gone.
Well, yes, let's hope so. Well, we've got 3 races in 3 weeks now, don't we? Which is it feels like. We're flooded with racing all of a sudden.
Yeah, it's gonna be a good couple of weeks. Hopefully, I say that it's Imola, Monaco, but Spain. Maybe not in that order, but it's definitely Imola next. But they're not known for their overtakes. But hopefully, it should be an interesting time in Formula One with upgrades coming to cars. So we'll see. Hopefully, gaps close. We might see the Black Bull, which is what Sam's dubbed the Mercedes 2.0, which I think if it goes viral, you know where Blackpool came from. It was definitely Lights Out podcast. It should be a good one. And so before we get to Imola, I thought we'd just take a little pause and look at something a bit different. So we've done our Lights Out, Lights On series on Lewis Hamilton. We've done what rules we changed to Formula One. We then looked at old rivalries. We decided today we'd discuss underrated drivers of the past and the present. And so we've each picked one from this season, and then we've each picked one from Formula One history, so from the history books. So it's just our opinion, but I think we're going to have, if you know nothing about some of these drivers, you should come away from this knowing a lot more. And if you're watching this season of Formula One, you may know more about these drivers, and so you can whip out some of the facts and some of the stats that will tell you about these 2 drivers from this season. But also you can just show off your F1 knowledge when we're just talking about some of the drivers from the past as well. But also if you are a seasoned Formula One fan, I think you'll enjoy our sort of debates around whether that's, I'm expecting there might be some debate about whether we actually think they are underrated or not. So Sam, I'll start the podcast by going over to you. Who from this season have you decided is underrated? And feel free to throw in your definition of what you define as underrated.
All right. So I have picked Esteban Ocon.
Very nice. Very nice.
Of Alpine. In fact, both drivers, both this one and the driver I've picked from a sort of long since retired perspective, I've defined as underrated as primarily never really getting an opportunity in a particularly fast front-running car as number one. And then number 2, I suppose, I wouldn't go as far as to suggest that both the drivers I've picked were like long-lost Formula One world champions or anything like that.
Right.
But I do think that like their index generally is a bit low in the paddock for a myriad of reasons, which we can talk about. But yeah, my first one is Esteban Ocon. So shall I give a quick 5-minute summary of Esteban Ocon?
Yeah, go on. Give us the history and the life of times of Esteban Ocon just to get up to speed, because I think that's helpful for us to really analyse if they are underrated by learning a bit about their history, how they got to Formula One, and then a bit about their Formula One story so far. And Esteban Ocon's been in the sport for several years now, so I think he's got a good sort of story to tell. So yeah, over to you.
Yeah, he has. He is an interesting driver. Kind of the history of his. In fact, both of them are actually. They're both the ones I've picked. Their route through to Formula One and what they did in motorsports. Quite an interesting story in both cases. So Esteban Ocon was born in Normandy in northern France, and he comes from quite humble beginnings, as so many great athletes have done. Um, his dad ran a garage in Evere in Normandy. And as he was growing up and they sort of discovered his karting ability, as so many Formula One drivers do, as they're very young. Unfortunately, because of the sort of financial situation, and as we've alluded to on previous podcasts, it's really expensive to get into Formula One and to maintain a kind of level of karting to get yourself spotted. His parents had to sell the family home. His dad had to sell the garage. And he spent a significant amount of his time in his childhood basically traveling around in a caravan and a camper van from sort of racing, karting weekend to karting weekend. Which is kind of amazing, really, when you think about what he's
Mm.
doing now. And who knows what his kind of Formula One salary is? I'm sure it's somewhere there on Google if you want to have a look. But it's kind of amazing, isn't it? Like what that, because that's not that long ago. Because they get into the sport so young, and yeah, it's quite an amazing start, really.
And also for the whole family to sort of, give up the family home and sell out the business to sort of fund his career and his dream.
Yeah, and it's a story that's true across so many, as I've alluded to, so many athletes and stuff. Like it's quite a common story, isn't it, where parents sort of dedicate their lives to their kids, sort of learning their trade, particularly in a racing perspective, funding so much of that themselves. So yeah, no, pretty amazing what he's done really since then. And he had as all generally excellent Formula One drivers do. He had a really good kind of karting career. You can't call it a career when they're kids, can you really? But had an excellent kind of series of karting performances over a number of years. So he won the karting championship, the cadet class in France in 2008, beating Antoine Hubert and Pierre Gasly. He was the runner-up in the WSK Euro Series in 2011, just behind one Max Verstappen. And then in F3, he won in
Oh wow!
2014, beating Max Verstappen,
Oh wow!
which is quite a feather in the cap, I think. I mean, anybody
Mm.
who's watched Max Verstappen race in any situation, in any car, beating him over the course of a season is extremely difficult. So some kudos there for sure. And that season in 2014 was pretty amazing for him, really. That's really what got him his break, I think. He was on the podium in 21 of 23 races. He got 15 pole positions. Just an unbelievably
That's
consistent.
extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean they had a good car, that team, but yeah, he was brilliant that season, and yeah, beat Max to the title. Then he went and won GP3 in 2015 as well. Another feather in the cap, beat some good drivers there. And then he kind of had a slightly interesting year or so in 2016 where he went off and drove touring cars for a bit in 2016, and then finally got the jump into Formula One and got a seat at Manor Racing. I don't know if you remember them.
They were
Way back.
Yeah, Manor Racing were what were they? They were originally Virgin Racing, and
Yeah.
then they were bought by Manor, who were sort of a team that'd been in motorsport for a long time, and they were a bit of a, they were one of the worst teams probably in recent Formula One history. They were always at the back, lots of issues. They also got through lots of drivers, and probably the most sort of famous thing that Manor will ever be remembered for is that Jules Bianchi was driving Manor before he had the fatal crash in Suzuka in Japan.
Yeah. Not a great record for them. And yeah, they were a genuinely terrible, terrible team. I mean, we don't really have any teams on the grid at the moment. So if you're any kind of a recent follower of Formula One in the last few years, there aren't really teams that are anywhere near as bad as Manor were back in 2016. I mean, they were getting lapped on a very regular basis. So yeah, not a pretty inauspicious year for him in 2016. But because of his talent, obviously, and what he'd done previously, he got a good move to Force India, as they were in 2017, partnering with Sergio Perez. It was quite a spicy rivalry actually over those couple of years, and quite an instant-packed couple of years. I know it feels like this for all young drivers, but particularly young drivers that are sort of quick and quite aggressive. But he came together with people semi-regularly and got into a few scraps in his time as well. But yeah, it was quite an interesting year, particularly 2017. So there are a couple of instances with Checo where Esteban Ocon was the quicker driver on the better strategy, and Perez refused to let him past, and there was a bit of spice attached to that, and he ended up finishing just behind Perez in 8th in the championship in his first season with Force India, which
Oh,
again is a pretty good return for a guy who's in his
that's
second year in
good.
Formula One.
Yeah, and also in first time in a proper competitive car, because that was the era of when Force India Racing Point were those really quite iconic pink cars, weren't they? And they were really good. They were sort of the best of the rest of the top teams, weren't they? At that point,
They were. Well, they were also known as the Pink Mercedes, weren't they? Because
yeah.
they stole. Well, they not stole. They didn't steal. They got all of their parts and their engine from Mercedes, who were at the time the most successful constructor by some
and they
margin.
copied the design of the previous year Mercedes car, which had won the World Championship, and that's why people started calling it. They were called the Pink Panthers for a bit, and then they were also the Pink Mercedes.
Yeah, that's right. And that was particularly true in 2019, I think. So just after Esteban moved on. But so in so Lawrence Stroll then comes along with his massive bags of cash, buys the team. They turn into Racing Point, and he has quite a. I don't want to say bad luck because that feels like a bit of an excuse, but he had quite a lot happen in 2018. So he had an accident with Perez, which Perez admitted his own fault in. He had a disqualification in a really good point scoring position because of a fuel flow issue with the engine. He then had a collision with Max Verstappen, which did not go down very well, as we know. Any time anyone has an incident with Max Verstappen, it tends not to go down very well. Max ended up pushing him after the race and had to serve some
like a fight, wasn't it?
further. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, they had a bit of a set too, which is a bit of a throwback. Really, you don't really see that too often in Formula One these days. But yeah, that was quite an iconic moment in 2018. And then he finished in 12th again, just behind Checo. And it was a bit of an open secret, really, like with Lance Stroll, sort of, his father obviously purchasing the team. It was pretty apparent pretty quickly that Lance was going to end up getting a seat, and they were never going to get rid of Perez because he was a consistent performer, and also he brought a lot of money into that team. It's forgotten that because of Checo and his marketability in Mexico in particular, he came with quite a lot of kind of financial benefit as a driver. So unfortunately for Esteban, that meant he was kicked out the door in 2018 and went and served as Mercedes reserve driver for 2019. But he nearly replaced Bottas. He nearly replaced him in 2019, apparently. Wow. I just think that is a massive sliding doors moment, isn't it? I would love to have seen what Ocon could have done in a Mercedes alongside Lewis Hamilton. I don't think he'd have beaten Lewis Hamilton at all, but I reckon he might have got closer than Bottas potentially. I don't know.
Yeah, he wouldn't have tailed off like Bottas did towards his end of his time in Mercedes.
Yeah, absolutely. So he joins Renault in 2020, as they were then. They're now Alpine, obviously, but they were Renault still back in 2020. And they were beset with reliability issues, unfortunately. That engine, I don't know if you remember the Renault engine in 2020, but that was the season that Max's car, because Red Bull were powered by Renault that year, went bang, I don't know, 3 or 4 times, I think. It was not good. But yeah, and he was also soundly beaten by Ricciardo that year, who's obviously a fantastic driver in his own right at that point, and definitely the leader of that team when Ocon joined them. But he still had a good season. He got his first podium at Sakir in 2020, picked up a win, his very first one and currently only win in Hungary in 2021, which was an absolutely amazing race. Well worth watching the highlights from that to take you back to 2021. That was a fantastic Grand Prix, that one.
He held off Fernando Alonso, didn't he?
He did, yes, who we'll be coming to shortly. But yeah, no, brilliant win that was for Esteban Ocon. And again, quite a kind of a big moment for him in his career, I think, because he had gone a fair old time, good 5 years in the sport without picking up a win. Never really got close either in that time. I mean, he had some pretty unfortunate luck when he was in podium positions previously, but he was never leading a race and had it stolen off him or anything. So yeah, that was a really big moment for him, and I think really demonstrated his capability behind the wheel. And yeah, 2021 he finished very close to Fernando Alonso, who's his teammate then. Got 7 points, got within 7 points of Alonso. 2021 is a pretty good effort. And then 2022, obviously last season, was it's a weird year for Alpine, I think, in general. I mean, we talked a bit about them at the start of the season. We've referred to them a few times in various podcasts around reviewing Grand Prix. But yeah, they had what felt like quite a quiet year. And then all of a sudden, they sort of got their car together, started picking up points. There was a bit of a rivalry between Alonso and Ocon as well. I think Ocon really started to come good last year and outperformed Fernando on a few occasions, which Alonso didn't like very much. And yeah, in last year, he ended up finishing 11 points ahead of Alonso and managed to beat him. And everyone knows how great Fernando is, 2-time world champion, currently loving life at Aston Martin, picking up podiums galore and hopefully looking to win a race this year. So Yeah, I don't there's only us underestimating how tough it is to beat Alonso over a season. So yeah, to do that is a pretty big marker as well. So that's where we are, kind of in Esteban Ocon as it is, Esteban Ocon world as it is at the moment. But I guess the reason I think he's a bit underrated is, as I say, he's never really had the opportunity in a really front running car, which I think would be interesting. I don't know if he's up there with your kind of Verstappens and Hamiltons and potentially Leclerc's, but he's definitely close to that conversation. I think a lot of people think
Mm,
Norris and others are generally lauded as the sort of next batch of potential future world champions, and it always grates me a little bit that Ocon's not really included in that conversation. Um, Not necessarily because he hasn't sort of outperformed the car, but it's almost like he's just a bit forgotten about.
yeah.
Um, I also think size is unfortunately against him. He's a tall man, and as
Six
another
foot.
tall man
6 foot.
who's sat in a basement he can't stand up in, he has my sympathy there. And yeah, being a tall F1 driver is really difficult. There have been historically quite a few very good Formula One drivers, but because of their size and in turn the weight they add to the car, and they never really had the opportunity either. So I kind of hope that doesn't happen to Ocon, unfortunately. But yeah, fingers crossed he can get a big move at some point in the future, or Alpine can build a car that's a bit more competitive than we've seen the last few years. But yeah, I think the opportunity never to have driven a front running car. And there are definitely, or there have historically definitely been issues with his driving to some extent. Like, he was a really quick driver, often very consistent, but he would just have these mad races. I mean, we talked about him early this season when he got 3 penalties in one race and equaled Maldonado's long heralded record. Friend of the podcast, Pastor Maldonado. He just has these kind of mad races every now and again, and just unfortunately sort of lets him down sometimes. But on pure pace, I think he should be further up the conversation than he is anyway.
Yeah. Just on mad races, my favorite Esteban Ocon meme is, I think this must have been when he was racing for Racing Point of Manor. There was 2 photos. There was one of him on the track, and one of him off the track, and the caption on the one of him on the track was Ocon, and then when he's off the track was Ock off, which I thought was quite good play as well. But I agree with you. I think, my view on Esteban Ocon is like, he had a very successful sort of junior career and came in with with a lot of promise, and was very good. Probably his peak in Formula One was those first couple of seasons in Racing Point. Um, and then I think he was unlucky to lose his seat, and then I think his manager, I don't know if it still is his manager, but his manager was Toto Wolff, and Toto basically helped him get in the drive at Renault. And at that point, he then cut ties with Mercedes, which I always thought was quite a big call to make, really, because he was giving up the opportunity to basically step in for if Lewis was ever going to retire, or to replace Bottas, and he would have easily, he would have, they would have searched from within, and he would have been above the list. He would have got it if he'd still been in the Mercedes sort of family. He would have beaten George to that second seat. So he kind of gave up that to become sort of. I definitely think he's now the main man at Alpine and Renault, and I think it's him. I think for him, he wants to sort of really build the team around him. And obviously, he's now got a very different teammate in Pierre Gasly, who's also very quick. But yeah, I would like to see him in a quick car, in front of the car, to see how he performs. And I think as well, you've hit a good point. He's not really sort of held in very high regard, and I think unfairly, because he's won a race which Lando Norris hasn't. And I think even the chat this season, I think everyone is acting as if Oscar Piastri is sort of the next world champion elect, basically, or he's one of the best. He's sort of the second best driver of that group that aren't quite in the top team, and like people like Ocon is sort of completely missed on the conversation, really. So yeah, must be pretty tough for him to sort of not really get the hype and recognition he deserves when he's been a quite consistent performer at Alpine.
He absolutely has. Yeah, I think he's definitely in the kind of like Lando Norris, Carlos Sainz conversation. I'd love to. I mean, it's hard to make a judgment about a guy who's never driven a front running car, isn't it? And that's part of the reason he's my pick. But yeah, there's definitely something about him that makes me think if you put him on one of those cars, you'd maybe see a slightly different driver potentially as well, because he is really talented, and like I don't think you win as much as he's won previous to sort of entering Formula One, and then picking up a win in a pretty average car and being a consistent point scorer as well. Like he does often, very regularly finish in the top 10 and deliver for his team. So yeah, of all the possible outcomes, it feels to me like it's more likely that he'll stay at Alpine and they'll potentially try and move that car further forwards rather than him moving to a top team. But I suppose you never know, right? It's possible.
Yeah, I suppose for him to get into a top team, because there's not really much conversation or rumors linking him to sort of Ferrari or Red Bull or Mercedes. I suppose for him to get that, he's got to show to those teams that he can outperform he can outdrive the Alpine, and he can turn around this bad car, an okay car, into something special and do some something special with it. Otherwise, they'll just think, well, he's doing an okay job. Whereas that's probably why some other drivers probably stand out to those teams, because Carlos Sainz to Ferrari, when he moved to Ferrari, he was driving incredibly well in that McLaren. It was clear that he was outperforming that car, and Ocon's never really shown that in a Formula One career, really, that he can perform the car, or drag the car up the grid. And that's in our lights out, lights on special on Lewis. That's one we said of one of Lewis's greatest traits, is that he can turn around a bad car and still get a result from it. Whereas I don't think we've ever really seen that from Ocon.
Yeah, no, that's a fair assessment. Although I would argue comparing anybody to Lewis Hamilton is extremely unfair. Actually, talking about one of, if not the greatest of all time, which is not the benchmark by which all good Formula One drivers should be measured. But no, I do. Yeah, he's definitely underrated. I think I don't know, like, to what extent, like how much he is underrated in a kind of world championship conversation. Probably not, but in general, in terms of like how much stock is placed in him as a driver, I think he's earned a bit more than he gets.
Yeah, and I think for him, he like I said, then he's not really going to get a call up to go into one of those top teams unless Toto Wolff is still got to deal with him to get him to sort out his career. But I think as well, he's basically now reliant on Alpine moving up the grid, and that's his chance of getting more wins, or getting more podiums. Whereas I think at the moment he's kind of just going to be, current trajectory is just going to be a very good midfield driver, and that will be it. And he'll pick up good points, but he won't get anything special from it.
Who have you picked for your current, from the current grid? Who have you picked as your most underrated driver?
We picked independently. We didn't converse about who's picking who. I've actually picked his current teammate, Pierre Gasly.
No.
Yeah, and we did touch him now. That's why I was a bit coy about not saying too much about Pierre Gasly, because I don't want to give it all away before going into him. So yeah, I've gone for his fellow countryman and his fellow teammate, Mr. Pierre Gasly. And we'll come on to this, but the two very sort of similar drivers, I think. In many ways. So similar to you, I'll give 5-minute spiel of the life and times of Pierre Gasly, and then we can have a bit of debate about Gasly. And then, because they're teammates as well, but also as we did discuss, we'll have a bit of debate about who we think is the better. So yeah, Gasly, fellow Frenchman, began karting in 2006, and actually was racing against Ocon in France as a youngster, and they were very close friends. And apparently, Ocon's father bought one of Pierre's brothers, I think, like spare like old go karts to give to Esteban Ocon. So sort of showing how close those families were, and they were really close friends. I think they travelled around everywhere. They went to the same circuits, and they really compete with each other. And they were, I think they lived within 30 minutes of each other growing up. And so I'll come on to that more, but that's an interesting sort of place marker there, that they were good friends when they were younger. Was successful in karting, moved up through the series and that. They went on to like Formula Renault, which Formula Renault is like a single-seater car, similar to like a Formula One car, much smaller, powered by Renault engines, and everyone's sort of got the same car. And there's lots of different, there's national ones, but there's lots of like European Formula Renault as well. And he went on to win the championship in Formula Renault in 2013. He then moved into GP2, which is now Formula 2, so the feeder series of Formula 1. And he actually finished run-up to Mr. Carlos Sainz, which is quite a nice thing. And you'll hear this. There'll be lots of drivers you'll hear mentioned throughout, and it shows you, that the talent, the talent always rises to the top.
Yep.
And he then becomes the champion of GP2 in 2016. But also, it was in 2014 he sort of catches the attention of the Red Bull Young Drivers Program, and I wouldn't say as successful as it was back then, but there was a period where the Red Bull Young Drivers Program was the scheme to get into Formula One, and all the best drivers were on it. So Max Verstappen was on it, Vettel was a little bit on it, Carlos Sainz, Daniel Ricciardo, Who else? We've got Sebastian Buemi, Brendan Hartley, Yuki Tsunoda's currently has come through it as well. Alex Albon was on it for a bit.
De
You know,
Vries.
De Vries as well. There's a whole list of drivers that have come through that scheme, and I think for a European driver, getting onto that was basically you knew that Red Bull were going to manage your career to Formula One really well. So that time in 2014, he then takes part in the Japanese Super Formula, which is again very similar to it's a single-seater racing category based in Japan. Very similar. They look almost identical to Formula One cars. He achieved 2 race wins and was the runner-up in the championship. And the season was cut short by the typhoon of Lan, and he was half a point off from winning the world championship. So if the season hadn't been cut short, he could have potentially been the Super Formula world champion. I think what's interesting as well is not many Formula One drivers did Super Formula. He was a bit of an outlier going to do something like that, but he was sort of wanted to get as much experience as possible. Also, turns out he had a one-off race in Formula E, finished 4th in his debut race there, so yeah, very good for him. And then, so as I said, he's part of the Red Bull driver program, and he makes his debut for Formula One with Toro Rosso, which is what AlphaTauri used to be. And just on a side note, it took me years to realize that Toro Rosso meant Red Bull in Italian. I'm generally not joking. I must have been following the sport for about 10 years until I figured that out. Anyway, moving on from that. But he gets into Formula One, is testing regularly with both Toro Rosso and Red Bull. And in his first season at Toro Rosso, does pretty well, starts off pretty well, gets a 4th place finish in Bahrain, which is one of the first sort of races in the season. And pretty good start to his Formula One career. Comes in and sort of does well at AlphaTauri. And then with Daniel Ricciardo moving to Renault, Red Bull decides to promote Pierre Gasly to be Max Verstappen's teammate at Red Bull Racing. This is before they become Oracle Red Bull Racing. So this is in 2019, but massive step up to go to a car at the front of the grid, and he really struggled. I remember at pre-season testing, he really struggled to cope with the car, and I think we've touched on before the way that Max likes his car. The car is basically designed around that principle. It's like really, is it like to be really on edge, like really
tail
late
happy,
braking?
pointy front end. It's Max's MO, yeah.
Yeah, and that's for someone that doesn't drive like that, and that wasn't his style. He really struggled. So he was spinning out, and he had quite a big crash at preseason testing. So from the get go, there was massive pressure on him. And then in his first race, qualified 17th, which is really bad. And then his best result was P4 at the British Grand Prix, and then in Hungary, he then gets lapped by Max, which is pretty humiliating, and shows you how far off the pace you are if your teammate in the same car is lapping you. And at that point in the season at Hungary, Max had 63 points, and I think he only had. I'm just trying to see here. Pierre only had 63 points, whereas Max had 181 points, had won 2 races and 5 podiums, whereas Gasly hadn't even gotten to the podium then. So there was a clear divide in performance and difference in performance. And then at that point then, as we go into the summer break of that point in the season, Christian Horner makes this quite savage move and quite ruthless decision to demote him back to Toro Rosso. And then that's when Alex Albon replaces him. And actually, I think that is probably the lowest point in Pierre Gasly's Formula One career. I remember after those couple of races, I think a lot of people could tell he was really down, really negative about, just his driving was off. And the rest of that season was him sort of just trying to rebuild his confidence. And it really did come across like a driver was sort of had lost their way, had been sort of really broken by sort of the humiliation of being dropped by Red Bull. And so he then is sort of rebuilding his career, and he actually has a really strong end to the season in that AlphaTauri. He goes on to sort of get, I think it's second at the Brazilian Grand Prix, and that actually showed a lot of people that he was still a really class driver, a really top quad driver, and still, it wasn't going to be. I think some drivers could have been completely broken by that demotion and then fizzled out of the sport or completely made more and more errors and disappeared, whereas he didn't do that. And then he returns for the next season with AlphaTauri in 2020. And that's when, similar to his countryman, he also gets his first Formula One win at the Italian Grand Prix in quite amazing circumstances. He takes an early pit stop before others do, and sort of that catapults him up to up the leaderboard. And then he manages to hold off Carlos Sainz, who's in the Ferrari at that point. Is he in the Ferrari at that point?
21, 2020, 21. No, I don't think he was.
No. Okay.
I think it was
He's
McLaren still.
Yeah, McLaren. Yeah, thanks. He managed to hold him off, and gets his first win. And he was the first French winner in 24 years. I think it's quite funny. Then a year later, Ocon goes on to win the race as well. And then the following season gets another podium at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. And he's in that season, I think in 2021, is probably his best season at AlphaTauri, apart from the win. Just consistently scores good points. He's just seen as probably the best of the rest of the drivers that season. And then last season, a bit of a mixed one for him. Car wasn't as good. A lot of mixed results, unreliability, but he did score points regularly, but then also went through periods of not scoring. Like there was a couple of streaks of not scoring points after several races. And then with the whole summer drama last year with Alonso going to Aston Martin and then Piastri moving to McLaren, Alpine decide to recruit Pierre Gasly to sort of partner Esteban Ocon, so then for the French team to have an all French lineup, which is, really exciting. But also, like I said, this is two people that didn't get on very well. Had gotten very well, and then they had a quite big falling out, which has never been really discussed. Their falling out, I think. What Pierre Gasly said about it, said that Ocon didn't start playing dirty and really didn't like it when they were younger, when Gasly started beating him regularly. But they didn't get on very well. But when they were signed together, apparently Ocon was happy for him to be signed as his teammate. And then since then, they've been pretty chummy. And I think if there's any partnership in this season of where there's going to be fireworks, I think it's those two. I think that if they start crashing into each other a bit more, they'll start winding each other up, and I think that'll be I think that's the one that's sort of the one that could ignite. And so I think for me, the reason why I classify Pierre Gasly as the most underrated driver is because I don't think he was ever given a fair chance at Red Bull. He was given half a season in a car that wasn't designed. It wasn't a fairly designed car. It was a very one-sidedly designed car for the other driver. And he's not like with Ocon. He's not really had that chance to win races. I think he's very fast. I think he's shown he's a regular point scorer. He's sometimes outdriven the car, and I think he is, in my opinion, better than Lando Norris. And if I was one of those top teams, I would pick Pierre Gasly over, if it was him versus Norris. I think he'd be the better driver. And he's shown that he is capable of winning races as well, as he did in Italy. He wasn't just luck. He did drive that very well to secure that as well. And before I go into sort of the wider debate about Pierre Gasly, I'll just reel off some stats for you. So Pierre Gasly has raced in 113 races, and apparently his average finish is 9.81. He's had 53 point finishes, which makes it about 46.9%. I say about 46.9%. It is 46.9%. And he scored 340 points and one win. Now, I've also got Esteban Ocon's numbers here. I've done a bit of research. Yeah. Oh. Esteban Ocon has done 116 races, so 3 more than Gasly. His average finish is 9.42.
Ooh.
So slightly better by 0.4 than 0.39 than Gasly. Mm-hmm. He's had 70 point finishes, so slightly better, which makes that 60.34%. And he scored 370 points and one win. So about 30 point difference between them. But in my opinion, as I was researching this, I think Gasly has had worse cars than Ocon has. So that's why he's not. That's why. No, I don't think he scored as many points as him. I think last season that how many times have Alpine sort of been in the race for 4th or 5th in the Constructors' Championship, whereas AlphaTauri have never really been in that conversation. But yeah, that there is my case for why I think Pierre Gasly, a brief history of Pierre Gasly, by why I think he's also very good. And also, I should say, I didn't include this, but Pierre Gasly is very good on Instagram, and he's got a reputation for liking everyone's posts on Instagram and leaving some quite funny comments as well. I'll let you do some research about Pierre Gasly on Instagram. But yeah, no, that's what's your view on Pierre Gasly?
I do rate Pierre Gasly. I think he is a very good driver. But pace isn't everything. I know it's a really important factor, particularly in Formula One drive, obviously. But I don't know. I think for me, Ocon's got the edge in a couple of key categories. So one, Gasly, yes, I get the point about Red Bull and the car being designed for Max, but he's still got the opportunity to drive a very, very fast Red Bull. And it wasn't like he just lost out to Max either. Like, I remember that period, and I did feel bad for him as well, because I think it's a pretty raw deal being the second driver at Red Bull when you don't want to be the second driver. And it must be really difficult when you've been a pretty dominant driver in every car you've been in, won loads of stuff, and then you finally get your gig at a good team and you come up against Max, and Max is an absolute monster. Like, there's no getting away from that. And it can't be easy mentally to deal with that. But the fact that he's had that opportunity and did wilt a bit, probably is in the sort of slightly against him category. And the only other thing the other thing I was going to mention as well is, like, I take the point about cars, but Ocon did drive a genuine backmarker for a whole year.
Yeah,
so that's probably in the mix as well. I don't know. I get the feeling that, like, I've seen Ocon go up against Fernando Alonso, who is himself an absolute monster. Like, he is not a good teammate. We know that. I mean, put aside all the stuff that's going on with Lance Stroll at the moment and however much he's being paid by Lawrence to be nice to his son, who's anybody's guess. But Alonso is a really tough opponent, a tough teammate to have, and he didn't wilt against him, and he beat him in the second season. He raced him. So I don't know. I just don't necessarily see Ocon moving to Red Bull tomorrow and wilting in the same way that Gasly did. Now, age is probably a factor. Gasly went there quite young. Maybe that's a bit harsh to count that against him, but I don't know. It's just my initial thoughts.
I think if Gasly goes back to Red Bull, tomorrow, I think he would be a much better driver and would get to grips with that car a bit more. And also I think he would deserve an opportunity to really get to know. I don't think the team would treat him as savagely as they did last time. I think they'd give him the opportunity they give him a period to really get to grips with the car as well. I would say the thing that Gasly's got for him that Ocon doesn't is that Gasly is not error prone, doesn't really cause many collisions, whereas Ocon's always had that and always struggled with that as well. And I think fair point. He has beaten Alonso, which is no easy feat. But that's all Gasly's had in recent years is just an erratic Yuki Tsunoda, who he's treated like a younger brother. So I think he's probably enjoyed being the big dog. And I think for a lot of people, it was clear last season that he had sort of outgrown AlphaTauri and sort of the challenge that was presenting him. I think everyone could see he was better than that team and was no longer needed sort of the training wheels on anymore to that support to sort of get him up into Formula One. So I think for him it's a really great opportunity this season to be in the Alpine, and if he can outdrive that car and firstly beat his teammate, which is the first thing in Formula One, you've got to beat your teammate. It wouldn't surprise me if it did put him into conversation for big seats. I think he could be. It wouldn't surprise me if he's on a short list for Mercedes or Ferrari. It wouldn't surprise me if they considered, and even Red Bull. It wouldn't surprise me if they would. I don't think they would not go to him again.
No, I don't think that's unfair. I think there are definitely opportunities there for Gasly. Yeah, well, I suppose we could probably return to this, couldn't we, at the end of the season and see which driver has outperformed the other one, and have a conversation. It's very, very close, isn't it? I mean, those statistics you've whipped out are incredibly close. Like their finishing positions being that close is unbelievable.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely there's not a huge amount in it, is there really?
No.
Maybe both of them.
I'm just seeing now. I've just got it up on my screen where they are in the driver standings so far. So Gasly's currently 10th with 8 points, and Ocon's 12th with 6 points. So we're only a few races in, and they probably both would be a bit higher if they'd not taken. Well, if they'd not been both collided in Australia in dramatic fashion.
Yeah.
And with that, we'll take a quick break. Hello and welcome back from the break. Hope you had a jolly old time. We had a very jolly old time here. We're just talking about rivalries and all sorts of stuff. So, Sam, we covered drivers of this current season in the first half. Now, we're now going to cover sort of past drivers, so they can be anyone that's not competing this season, basically. I'm very intrigued to see who you've gone for because there's obviously lots of Formula One history to pick from. You could have gone from you could go recent years, or you could go from 20 years ago or 50 years ago, even the start of Formula One. So I'll hand over to you now. Who are you going to talk to and present as your driver from the past? That's the most underrated.
So there was a bit of a shortlist for this one.
Ooh,
And I've actually picked someone who's, and you love this phrase, I know you do, because I've heard you say it to me many, many times. I've picked a driver who was before my time.
nice.
But I picked him. Well, I'll dispense with the beating about the bush. I've picked Martin Brundle. Will.
Ooh, very good, very good.
Yeah, so I picked him.
Sky Sports legend.
Sky Sports legend. Yeah, so I've picked him for a couple of reasons. One, I do think he's genuinely a bit underrated. But secondly, like for so many F1 fans, he's a pundit. He's not. People don't really think of him or remember him as a Formula One driver, and he was a really good one. And I think it's worth remembering that. So I thought I'd bring a bit of Brundle to the table.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put my hands up now and say, I don't really know much at all about Martin Brundle's Formula One career. I know he was teammates with Schumacher, but that's about it. And I think as well, the sort of shows you how good he is at his job as a pundit now and a sort of a presenter on Sky and a commentator. He's very much not really regarded as, oh, here's the ex Formula One driver, and he sometimes brings that in his sort of analysis or his commentary. Whereas people like Jenson Button or Nico Rosberg or David Coulthard, whenever they're on these programs, they're very much like and here's ex driver David Coulthard, whereas he's managed to shake that, which shows you how good of a pundit is. But we're not here to talk about punditry. We're here to talk about Formula One and racing. So let's give us your spiel of the life and times of Martin Brundle, the Formula One driver.
And it is quite. There is quite a lot in here. And by the way, so
I'm ready to be educated. I'm ready to be educated.
All right. So now, obviously, as I've alluded to, he's very much known for his punditry, less so his racing. But there's a lot of pedigree there. So he started in Formula One in 1984 with Tyrrell. But before that, and the reason I think he knows cars, genuinely all cars and so much about them, is I think he tried pretty much every different type of racing on four wheels it's possible to try before entering Formula One. So he started, so grew up in Norfolk in Kings Lynn, and started off in what can only be described as the most bumpkin sounding form of racing I've ever heard, and short of tractor racing, which is a thing. So he started off in something called grass track racing in Norfolk, which is basically racing little cars and or bikes and side pods around fields and tracks.
Never heard of that before.
Yeah. And then he tried his hand at hot rod racing as well. He was really excellent in both. So yeah, quite an unorthodox entry into motorsport. And then before getting to Formula One, he tried. He did a bit of Formula Ford. He did BMW touring cars. He partnered Sir Stirling Moss in the British Saloon Car Racing Championship as well. And tried all these different formulas. So I think I mentioned before, didn't I, when we talked a bit about Senna and Prost and Hakkinen and people like that, Formula One was very much the Wild West in the 80s and early 90s, and this is symptomatic of that. Like, you've got a guy with a serious amount of racing talent who's trying pretty much everything before coming to Formula One.
He was the journeyman of the motorsport world.
He was, but yeah, bearing in mind he was doing this in his late teens, early 20s, so just probably having a great time figuring out what can I drive fast this year. Anyway, so in 1983 he gets a gig in F3 and ends up finishing second behind Ayrton Senna in the championship, and he only lost out to him on the last lap of the last race of the season. Which is amazing. I mean, Senna is widely regarded as one of the best ever. And for kind of, I don't want to say plucky Martin Brundle, that sounds really reductive, but like Martin Brundle of, green track racing in Norfolk fame to come second to the great Ayrton Senna, as he's known now. Pretty mean feat. And that got him his seat in Formula One in 1984. So he started with Tyrrell, who are pretty average, bowing average team. They were borderline poor at times, but they built a few good cars back in the kind of 80s and again slightly early in the early 90s. But yeah, when he started, they weren't great. But he was quite an aggressive driver, quite quick as well, widely regarded as a good driver on the grids, and talked about in some quite big conversations with some of the better drivers that went on to win championships. Unfortunately, he had a massive accident in 1984 in Dallas. He missed the entirety of the rest of the season. So I think he drove 7 races and then had a huge accident in the 8th one in Dallas. And he broke both of his ankles in the
Jeez.
accident, nearly lost his left foot to amputation because the damage was so bad. And
Flippin'
he still to this day can't run, physically can't run. And he also, and this is a really important thing, he can't left foot brake, which in a Formula One car is huge, right? So
Yeah.
in your average family car, you've got 3 pedals if you're driving a manual, clutch, brake, and an accelerator, or gas if you're in the States. And generally in a racing car, or particularly in a Formula One car, you only have 2 clutch, and you only have 2. You have a brake and an accelerator pedal, and everything, all the clutch and stuff's done on the steering wheel is these days. And certainly as he progressed through the 90s, that's how the cars were designed. And his inability to use his left foot to brake basically meant he did absolutely everything on his right foot, which is pretty remarkable of itself.
That'd be a very strong right foot right now.
Yeah, it must be. Yeah, well, yeah, geez, dread to think. But anyway, he wasn't at Tyrrell all that long. He obviously left them after a year and then went to a team called Zach Speed, who were terrible. He was there for 2 years.
It sounds like Zach Brown sort of like offshoot speed, like his own sort of private team. Zach Speed.
I was doing the research for this and I was like, do I even spend any time looking into this team just out of interest? And I was like, I did have a look, but I was like, well, it's not relevant for the pod, so I won't include it. But they were terrible. I mean, it's quite funny to look at how terrible, but yeah, I think he finished like 23rd and 24th in the championship or something mad. Both years he was there. And then left in 1988, went off to drive sports cars and did that very well as well. So 1988, he was the world sports car champion. He also won the 1988 24-hour in Daytona and the 24-hour in Le Mans in 1990, which again is a hugely prestigious racing event. I'm sure many of you will have heard of it. And won both of those driving a Jaguar, of course, who were building some pretty remarkable sports cars back then. Incidentally, if you're interested in seeing the car that Martin Brundle won the Le Mans 24-hour in, it's in the British Motor Museum up near Stratford-upon-Avon. It's the Jaguar XJR9. It's quite iconic, worth a Google if not. They've built some amazing cars, and worth a look. And also in 1988, he was the test driver for Williams. So as I was alluded to, like the Wild West, like it's not like it is now. You didn't have drivers on like specific programs or generally committed to teams for long periods of time. People moved around all the time and were in and out of the sport on a regular basis. So he was out of the sport properly until 1989. Returned to Formula One with Brabham in '89, and then sort of flitted between Formula One cars and sports cars for a bit. But he properly came back to Formula One in 1992. So he joined Benetton, and his teammate was one Michael Schumacher.
Oh wow!
Now he never.
My history was right. I was correct.
You were absolutely right. Yeah. So I mean, so already we've ticked off Senna and Michael Schumacher on the list of drivers that he's raced and nearly beaten in the case of Senna, and in the case of Schumacher, so he never out-qualified him, and I do think that probably tacks against him a little bit. Bearing in mind, Michael Schumacher is again, similarly comparing anybody to him as with Lewis Hamilton is extremely unfair because again, one of the absolute greatest drivers ever. But he outraced him quite regularly. So in 1992, I think he ended up outperforming him in like 5 or 6 races in a row, despite qualifying behind him on the grid. So really demonstrated his like racecraft and ability to get a car through a race quickly and more quickly than his teammate. I think that's quite an underrated trait in a driver as well. And certainly when you look definitely at I mean, Hamilton's quite a good example because he didn't always qualify on pole for all those years that he was winning, and he often found a way to win races, and just his racecraft was and is still so excellent. I think Brundle is in a similar category.
High praise.
Yeah, and so he had a fantastic season in 1992, and then of course because Wild West, he was dropped. Everybody was absolutely horrified. I have looked at some of the like reporting and stuff in the papers, and particularly the British papers were like absolutely up in arms about it, particularly because Benetton like weren't really like known for anything other than like designing clothes and happening to own a Formula One team back then. This is before they won the championship with Michael in '94. But I remember, some of the press cuttings and stuff from that particular decision are quite funny, worth a look. And he nearly got the drive at Williams, and this is similar to Ocon and his kind of Mercedes sliding doors moment. This was Brundle's really. He was He was kind of on the list of potential drivers to take the Williams seat. They were world champions at the time. Williams, after Prost had won it, producing unbelievably fast cars all through the 90s, and they ended up winning an absolute ton of championships that decade. But he lost out to Damon Hill, who went on to win the championship in 96. Yeah, just a kind of unfortunate sliding doors moment for Brundle there, unfortunately. And then he went to a team called Ligier in 1993. Now, he ended up finishing 7th in 1993, but he was the highest performer in a car without active suspension. Now, I'm not going to get super nerdy about this because this isn't the podcast for it, but that is a crucial factor in the speed of those cars back then in the early 90s. So Williams basically were at the absolute forefront of car design and introduced active suspension. They absolutely walked championships. And obviously lots of the other top teams ended up bringing it in as well.
Active suspension is when the car computer is programmed to basically change the suspension level, right, and change the suspension for different corners. So it's doing it on behalf of the driver, right, and it makes a massive difference to sort of the drive and the way they can attack corners.
That's right. So it was designated to be so overpowered that it's actually outlawed in Formula One and has been for a long time. Because it was so effective and made the cars so fast. And he was driving a car without that, finished 7th in the championship, as I say, highest performer in a car without active suspension in 1993.
Fair play, Martin. Fair play.
Yeah, not a bad effort. And then that was kind of, I would say that's one of his most probably successful seasons in the sport. And then he moved to McLaren in 1994 and partnered.
I never knew that he raced for McLaren.
And guess who he partnered, Will?
Is it your one and only Mika
Bay.
Hakkinen?
It's Sam Bay, Mika Hakkinen. And again, it's just a shame he went there when he did, because McLaren were building such good cars in the late 80s and early 90s. And then all through the mid 90s, as I alluded to in our special episode on rivalries, McLaren was shocking. They had a series of terrible engine providers. The car was just an absolute stinker, loads of unreliability. Yeah, it's just a real pity. He basically missed out on driving all the best cars, unfortunately, in that period. So we never really got to see him either in a Williams or a McLaren or even a Ferrari as well. They built some pretty good cars towards the end of that decade. A bit of a shame, really. He had a massive accident with Jos Verstappen, Max Verstappen's dad, as well in 1994. But still performed pretty well. He picked up a podium in Monaco, finished second behind Michael Schumacher in a terrible, terrible McLaren. And then lost out to Nigel Mansell for the McLaren seat in 1995 and went back to Ligier. So he had his final season in 1996 at Jordan, as they were back then, Eddie Jordan's team. You'll remember them because they were raced in yellow and they were often, or were generally, sponsored by the cigarette brand Benson and Hedges. He partnered with Rubens Barrichello. There's a few big names on Martin Brundle's list of teammates. Pretty average season. I mean, Jordan weren't really up to much, to be honest. They never really were. It was essentially one massive party being in that team. So I expect he had a lovely time. But you had a massive
jolly old time.
A jolly old time at Jordan. But he had an enormous accident in Australia, which is often played whenever they go back to Albert Park every year, and that basically put pay to his Formula One career. Like he walked away from that accident, but he said at the time he was never really the same afterwards, and decided to quit the sport in 1996.
Jeez.
And then has moved to commentary. Did some other like sports car bits and bobs after he left Formula One, but nothing to the level that he achieved before, obviously by winning the Le Mans and winning Daytona and things. But all in all, I think he's one of the more underrated drivers from that period. I think he bear in mind he drove in an era where he was up against the likes of Senna, Prost, Schumacher, Hakkinen, like some absolute
Mansell,
some absolute like goats in there, and still managed to perform to a really high standard. Never in a really top car at all. And obviously, as I've alluded to, like demonstrated a real capability of driving cars fast across a myriad of different formulas and car types and whatever surfaces in the case of grass track racing. And I just think that's a kind of underrated quality as well in a driver. So yeah, there you go. There's my little Martin Brundle love-in.
That's very good. I mean, I learned a lot there, and I hope you did listening as well. I mean, it's interesting as well because he's obviously had some very serious crashes which have sort of defined, moments in his career. But also some of those, that one we said he broke both of his ankles. Like that's at a time when the safety in the sport is not at the highest level it was, and there was probably as we saw after in the years followed it, drivers are still being killed by accidents. So like this, the safety came on a lot of it. So there was a lot of risk of serious injury or death at that point when he's having that crash when he's breaking both his ankles. So to survive and then to recover and keep on racing and still be quick is an amazing feat in itself, really. And I think you're right. I think there's obviously lots of opportunities he's had, whereas being to Williams or McLaren, where nearly at Williams, where he could have been in the quickest car and he hasn't, and then sort of ended up being sort of the next best thing, really, and never quite had the opportunity to be at the top. And I think that's an interesting theme that we've seen so far in our discussions of the underrated drivers, that people have never really had the opportunity to be at the very front and to show their talent, but you can still see how talented they are. And you're right, he's had a good range of teammates as well.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's. I think the real big ones were missing out on the Williams drive in the early 90s, and then missing out on the McLaren era of dominance in the late 80s,
and to be dropped from Benetton as well, just as they then go on to win as well. Who was he? Why was he dropped from Benetton?
I don't know. I mean, I think it was performance related, but yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot of surprise about it because he did a really good job, I think, that season. So yeah, it was pretty surprising.
Well, I've learned a lot there. That's I feel like it's a very strong case for underrated driver. I think you've hit all the criteria you set at the start of the episode.
Yeah, well, and nice to just talk about Martin Brundle in a non commentator Sky Sports context, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, well, so who have you gone for? I'm interested now. Who have you picked for your?
So I've not gone as back far in Formula One history as you have. I did weigh up doing Daniel Ricciardo, which feels a little bit like a bit of a cop out because he's still kind of active in the sport. He's not quite sort of past driver, but I thought there's bits of Daniel Ricciardo that is underrated. The fact and that's probably because of the career decisions he's made from leaving Red Bull to go to Renault, and then the McLaren move not working out. I think a lot of people now sort of have written him off as a driver, and I actually think he's probably on his prime as one of the best drivers on the grid. But yeah, I decided not to do Daniel Ricciardo. I've gone for someone else. I've gone for Robert Kubica. So Robert Kubica, as you'll come to learn, was a Polish driver who raced in the sport from 2006 until actually pretty recently. He was a teammate of George Russell's, which I completely forgot about.
Yeah.
And had until this season had been a test driver at Alfa Romeo, which we'll come on to. But yeah, I'll give you a brief spiel on the life and times of Robert Kubica, and then I'll come to you, Sam, for your thoughts on Robert Kubica.
Excellent, hit me.
So he entered Formula One in 2006 at a similar sort of time as Lewis Hamilton, and I think similar to sort of Martin Brundle with Robert Kubica, there are several sort of sliding door moments where he was always sort of considered a future world champion, and events went the wrong way and was basically robbed of those opportunities, which we'll come on to. But anyway, going back to the very start, starts karting in Poland as a youngster, and he won 6 titles in 3 years. And because the karting scene was not very good there, he actually moves to Italy to take part in their junior karting championship, and he is the first foreigner to win the Italian junior karting championship, which is quite a cool feat. And then he sort of moves around a lot of different sort of feeder series. So he's in Formula Renault, which we touched on as sort of the single-seater Renault ones, and he joins the Renault development driver program at a really young age. And he took part in Formula Renault in Italy. He was in sort of something called the Euro Cup as well, and he also took part in the Brazilian Formula Renault in 2000, which he won as well. He then moves to Formula 3, which is the level below Formula 2. And then he also enters something called the World Series, which is by Renault, and he actually wins that championship. And as a result of winning that championship, the reward, the prize, is getting to go and test for the Renault Formula 1 team. And this is in 2005, which is the year when they were winning the World Championship with Fernando Alonso. So he obviously does very well in those sort of tests and shows people, and sort of build a lot of hype about him as well. And in 2006, doesn't even go to GP2 or Formula 2 equivalent, to go straight from that World Series by Renault Championship and go straight to becoming the BMW Sauber's Formula One reserve driver, which is an amazing feat to sort of skip out. You know, I don't think we've seen anyone in recent times that skipped out basically a whole section of sort of motorsport at that time. And he was electric in that as that reserve driver in Friday practice sessions and in private sessions. He was lightning quick in that car, and there was open speculation throughout that season in 2006 that he was going to basically get a seat anytime, and he would become the first Polish driver. And then sort of a miracle sort of happens. His debut in Formula One in a race comes completely out of nowhere. So Jacques Villeneuve, who was pretty iconic driver, quite a controversial driver, son of Gilles Villeneuve, is another legend of the sport. Gilles Villeneuve has, who's sort of the lead driver of BMW Sauber, has quite a big crash at the German Grand Prix, and was complaining of headaches after the crash, and in the week after it, and then the team doctor ruled him out of the next race that following weekend at the Hungarian Grand Prix, and so Jacques Villeneuve is absolutely furious about this. He thinks he's fit enough to race, but the doctor says, no, you're not getting the car. So the team decide to put Robert Kubica into the car for that race. Kubica, in his first ever Formula One race, qualifies ninth, ahead of his teammate, who's much more experienced, and a nice German chap called Nick Heidfeld. And in his first Formula One race, goes on to finish seventh, which I think is such a cool sort of feat. As a debut in your Formula One, but then quite harshly quite a horrible way for this sort of memory to end for him. The car gets disqualified for being underweight, because that was the time when they were having to refuel the car, so they must have burnt through too much fuel or underfueled the car.
Yeah.
So not a great debut, but not a bad debut at the same time. After this, Villeneuve is still so angry with the team that he decides to leave the team. And so Kubica gets promoted for the rest of the season. And within that rest of that season, he then goes on to get a couple of races later a podium at the Italian Grand Prix, which is only his third ever Formula One race. And I think for me, that's one of the reasons why he's such a talent, because he came into the sport at short notice and hit the ground running and was beating his teammate and scoring podiums. 2007 comes along, consistently scoring in the points, and then you'll have seen this crash in some of the sort of the Formula One montages, and I think it's even in the entrant, the Formula One start music in that montage. He basically has a crash at the Canadian Grand Prix, and if you've never seen it, I just search Kubica crash Canada Grand Prix into YouTube, and basically he hits a bit like a mound of earth, and then he hits. So then the car takes flight. He hits one wall and he hits another wall, and the car was so heavily damaged that you could actually see his feet exposed, because the front wing is basically, and the front of the car is completely gone because it's such high impact. And he was subject to 75G. So usually in a car, in a passenger car, you'll feel about 1G move around where turning a corner a bit sharply. Formula One drivers usually experience about 4G maximum, and that's very rarely. And he experienced 75G. Can you just imagine that? 75G. Gets taken to hospital. Luckily, has not broken any bones in his body, and is conscious and talking. So, and then, which I think is even more remarkable, only misses one race, which is literally 2 weeks later, and a chap called Sebastian Vettel replaced him. I wonder what happened to him. And yeah, so he only misses one race, and then he's back in the car for the rest of that season. And then, so quite an incredible thing to come back, and shows you the safety of Formula One to sort of survive such a horrendous crash and not be, injured seriously from it. And then 2008 is probably his best season of Formula One. Starts really strongly, gets pole and 2 second place finishes in the first couple of races. He wins Canada, sort of outmaneuvers Lewis, and gets quite lucky from strategy as well, beating his teammate as well. And then Canada is leading the driver championship. So starts the season really strongly, but the second half of the season, it was kind of much weaker. The car wasn't as reliable, and he actually ends up finishing the world championship in fourth. So that was the scene when it was like Massa and Lewis were going for the title, and he was in the conversation for quite a lot of it, and then sort of faded away. And then 2009 is where things start to go a bit wrong. So BMW, the car isn't as good. It's the year of the double diffuser, and Brawn are really it's the year of
Yep.
Brawn, isn't it? Yeah. And so Brawn come out of nowhere, and Red Bull come out of nowhere and sort of storm up the field, and they really struggled. And it wasn't until they fitted something called the double diffuser, which is basically what the Brawn had from the start of the season. It was like a loophole they'd found, and it basically gave the car a lot more downforce. And as soon as BMW fitted that to the car, it was much quicker. And but at that point, season was basically over for him. He couldn't really challenge for the World Championship. He didn't score a podium until Brazil, and then in that season, BMW decided to quit the sport, which is probably a real shame, because that BMW was an absolutely beautiful car. And I would say this: Robert Kubica has driven some of the best looking cars in Formula One history, some of the best liveries. And for those that don't know what livery is, sort of just the car design of what with all the different sponsor logos and the color scheme. And I'm going to put this on the Instagram feed, and I'll put it on Twitter as well. If you go to our Twitter and Instagram pages, you'll see this. I'll put a selection of some of the cars, and you'll agree with me, they are some of the nicest looking ones. It was a lovely blue and white car, the BMW Sauber. So anyway, they quit the sport. He's left as a free agent, and he returns to Renault, the team he tested for, and in a delightful bright yellow and black striped car, which was I love that car. It was such a good looking car, and I used to always love driving it on the Formula One games. And then during that season, 2000, sort of in 2010, it looks like there's rumours that he's going to replace Felipe Massa at Ferrari. But then Felipe Massa sort of turns around a couple of results, and they renew his contract. So then he stays at Renault. And it was at that point where he turned around. Like, that car wasn't as good as Renault, but there's a lot. I was just reading through it earlier, and the results he got from poor qualifying positions, or from strategy stuff, it was all down to him. And I saw a comment from a journalist saying that he'd shown at the tracks that sort of demand the most of a sort of and show off a driver's skill, he was outstanding. So at Monaco, Spa, and Suzuka, that's where driver skill was sort of the most important thing, and you can make up for performance. And he dominated there, and he was on the podium for 2 of those races, which is great to see him sort of get that plaudit and honour, despite not really being in the best car on the grid, sort of being the best of the rest, really. And then 2011 rocks by. Renault rebrand to Lotus Renault. That was another good looking car with the black and gold, very nice. And then this is the major sliding door moment for Robert Kubica, and this is the really sad thing about Robert Kubica's sort of Formula One career. Before the season starts, he's been out testing the Lotus Renault car, and then takes part in a rally crash. He's really takes part in a rally race. I'm sort of giving it away a bit there, in Switzerland. He was really into sort of other forms of motorsport, and has a really, really serious rally crash. And I think he's stuck in the car for like over an hour while the paramedics try and get to him, and just shows you that his co-driver gets away completely unscratched. Robert Kubica had fractured his arm, his elbow, his shoulder, and both of his legs, and they had to partially amputate his arm because it was so badly damaged from the crash. He then misses the whole of the 2011 season, and at that point, as he's starting his recovery, Lotus Renault announced that he's not going to be ready for 2012. And he revealed actually a few years later that at the start of 2011, before he had this crash, he'd signed a deal with Ferrari to go and race for them. So can you just imagine you starting off, getting ready for 2011 season, knowing, it's going to be sorted for next season, and then just be all disappear and to lose the opportunity to be at the very front.
With Alonso, right, as well, in 2012 it would have been.
Yeah.
In a good car. That was they came close to winning it that year as well.
Yeah, and I think if he'd stayed in that team, I think he could have really, really threatened for world championships. I think he would have turned some of those poor cars, and I think him and Alonso would have been such a force. And it's just such a shame, because up until that point, his Formula One career is just outstanding. Like, he's so good in that BMW. He's really strong in the Renault, and he just seemed. I remember watching Formula One sort of as a teenager, I just always used to love watching Kubica because he was so quick, good at overtaking, but also very good with his strategy as well. And that was a time when there was refueling, so the strategy was even more complex, and he was really central to those calls as well. And then, he then has to sort of go away to recover. So he kind of disappears from Formula One for quite a while. He goes back into rallying, sort of get himself back into motorsport, and obviously it's a lot less demanding than Formula One. He wins the World Rally 2 series in 2013, only 2 years after having this awful crash. And the World Rally 2 series is like the level below the World Rally sort of stage. And he then moves on to that as well. Also does endurance racing, which is like 24-hour races like Le Mans. And then I think this is the most remarkable thing ever. This is also one of the reasons why I think he's underrated. In 2017, only 6 years after this awful crash, he makes his first move of his comeback to try and get back into Formula One. And he actually tests the car, the 2012 Renault car. And Renault was it was a private test that Renault did for him, and I think they were quite surprised by how quick he was, considering he was struggling. I think there was rumors that he wasn't using his left hand because that's the one that was amputated. Like he was having to over rely on his right hand to do a lot more of the steering, and he was still quick and consistent, and was doing lots of laps. I think he did in the test he did over 100 laps in a day, which is not bad going. Then tested for Williams as well. Was sort of teased as an option to replace Massa. At that point was at Williams, and then he becomes George Russell's teammate at Williams, and that was when Williams. I mean, I did say he had good-looking cars. This is when Williams was the very back of the field. The car was terrible. It looked slow, and it looked like toothpaste as well. Genuinely not joking. It looks like toothpaste. You'll have to see the Instagram to see that as well. And I think George does pretty well and out qualifies him at every qualifying session. But Kubica gets lucky in one race and manages to, I think someone gets disqualified.
I remember, yeah.
Yeah, and he gets a point. So then he actually then beats George in the World Championship, which is pretty unlucky in George, but fair play to him for being in the right place at the right time to get a point. And then at that point, I think he's kind of a bit fed up of being there anymore. So he decides to leave. Kubica decides to leave the team. He then moves to Alfa Romeo, and at this point, he's got the backing of a Polish oil refining company, and they I think they basically help him get the Alfa Romeo test driving job by sponsoring the team. And that was in 2020, and then in 2021, he's still there as a reserve driver. And Kimi Räikkönen, the main driver, had COVID a couple of times, so he stepped in. And this is a really cool stat. He only competed in 2 races in that season, but he scored higher, had better finishing positions than Nikita Mazepin, who was racing for Haas. So finished higher in the World Championship than him, despite only being in 2 races, which is just amazing. It's such a good stat. And then he left the team when Orlen, his sponsors, sort of basically decided to go and sponsor AlphaTauri this year. So he was sort of in the sport until last year. And so yeah, I think for me, he'd always showed that he was competitive, even when cars were uncompetitive. I think he found himself driving midfielder or backbencher teams, and I think he managed to sort of make it competitive and really showed off his driving skill. And then he was robbed of the opportunity to go to a top tier, and it's a shame BMW pulled out the sport, because I thought they were quite a good sort of good constructor team. I don't think we've really seen a constructor team like them since, really, that were just very quick and very sort of fast, moved fast and light and loose. Whereas I think Alpine are a bit slow and a bit porous. But yeah, I thought he was really good for them, and then obviously robbed of the opportunity to go and race for Ferrari. And then also as well, I don't know if this makes him underrated as well. He's quite a subdued sort of personality. He's quite reserved, and I wonder if that sort of means he doesn't sort of get the attention and sort of praise and recognition he does for, because he's not that high profile as a sort of character. And I think for him, he preferred to do the driving, do the talking, rather than being in front of the cameras. But yeah, that's my my spiel for you there on Robert Kubica.
That was excellent. That's yeah, a little trip down memory lane. I love Robert Kubica as well. So as soon as you said his name, I was like, oh yes, I'm going to enjoy this. Um,
Why did you think he was so good?
well, it won't surprise you to hear that his personality appealed to me a lot. He was just unbelievably chill, not, as you've alluded to, like not bothered about media attention at all. Like of a kind of, I always feel like him and Kimi Räikkönen would have just been perfect teammates. It would have been so much fun because every
Mm.
press conference, neither of them would have answered a single question, which would have made it good fun. But yeah, no, I just really liked him, and yeah, there was something about his like committed racing style as well that really appealed. I think you're right, like that early period with BMW was really like the absolute peak for him, wasn't it? Unfortunately, as you say, could have had drivers of some other good teams as well later down the line. But yeah, there was something about those cars pre kind of hybrid era, and the way he in particular like chucked a car around a circuit and hauled it up the grid was really impressive. And just generally the way he went about his business, like it was he was perennially classy. I don't remember him ever getting into like any scraps or disagreements or arguments with everybody. Everybody really liked him. Just a sound bloke, but unbelievably talented. Yeah, and just yeah, it was a real shame. I remember when BMW pulled out, I was a bit gutted about that as well. They were a really good team, and they had some great drivers in Kubica and before in Montoya as well, and like ran Michael Schumacher close, and a few other good teams down the road too. So yeah, that was a real shame, and yeah, it's always a bit difficult when you get left without a seat, isn't it? You're not spoiled for
Yeah.
choice, and yeah, unfortunately, he just joined Renault after their very very brief peak in sort of 2005, six, and seven. Um, so yeah, a bit of a pity, but yeah, brilliant, brilliant driver. I think he's a bit different to the other ones we've talked about actually, because I feel like among F1 fans, he's probably a bit more in the consciousness. I think like he would be. I don't know. I feel like maybe it's because he's more recent, but I think if you were to ask the average Formula One fan now, like the ones that have followed the sport for a fair amount of time and know the sport, let's say, well, to list some of the best drivers never to have won the world championship, I feel like Kubica would be in the top five like quite
Yeah.
regularly with
Yeah, that's
fans.
fair. That's a fair shout.
But yeah, brilliant. Yeah, brilliant driver. No, thanks for that. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed.
I think the reason why he's also underrated is because like he basically got there. He basically had the deal lined up for Ferrari, but it's kind of like we never got to see what he would have been like in a Ferrari, and
Yeah,
that was the theme that we had with the other three, was that they never quite made it to the team at a peak, whereas he would have been challenging for races and wins and for championships as well, and he just didn't get the opportunity because of his accident. So it's quite a different sort of that his accident then meant. I think then because of his comeback to Formula One was never quite the same, and he was never the same. He was when he came back to Formula One after his recovery, he was never the same driver. I just think the demand of it was just not the same. But also, he did end up in some awful cars on that toothpaste Williams car, which was an absolute shocker. And I think that must have been very hard for him to have worked that hard and focus that much time and energy to come back and not. It must have been hard for him to come back and not be the driver he was. But for him, maybe he saw it differently. Maybe he saw a lot of satisfaction. You know what? I've come back to the absolute pinnacle with a slightly amputated hand here, and I'm I think I've seen something on board footage of him driving basically one handed, like unreal.
yeah. No, I fully agree with you. Very much an underrated driver. Yeah, it's a real shame that 2012, him and Alonso in the same team in a Ferrari. Oh, that would have been so
Yeah.
good. I'd love to have
Just
seen
makes
that.
just makes me sad because, like I say, he was just such a talented driver before then, and I think it's like we were robbed of it's probably a different period of Formula One sort of history. And I think just going back to his intro into Formula One, I don't think we've really seen. I'm just trying to rack my brains. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we've never really seen a driver come into the sport fresh as a rookie at an okay, semi decent team, a midfield team, and like hit the ground running, and almost like take it on, and almost such like he was amazing from the get go. To get a podium in his third race. I can't think in recent Formula One history we've had someone come into the sport and sort of light it up like that, like he did. I mean, the only one I can semi kind of sort of grasping out a little bit with straws is a bit is Charles Leclerc, but that Sauber wasn't quite the same as him in the BMW.
Yeah, no, that's fair. No, it is quite unusual, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, you get kind of prodigy drivers get good seats at good car in good teams quite quickly, and then they tear it up. And you never really see what they're like at the back of the grid necessarily. But I don't know. Maybe I think Max is probably in the conversation. To be fair,
Yeah.
when he joined and started at Italian Red Bull, he his points. I think I remember him, scoring points really consistently in that car and scoring podiums and stuff. So I think he's. But as we've alluded to, comparing anybody to people like Max is and Lewis and others is deeply unfair because they're kind of generational talents. But
then maybe that shows you how good Kubica was as a talent. Then if he was doing similar sort of things, and you just never, we never got to see where he would have gone if he'd been in those opportunities that both Max and Lewis had.
Yeah,
would be in a parallel universe. Would we be talking now about Robert Kubica, 2-time world champion or 1-time world champion? Because you could have gone on and beaten Vettel. You never know. That could have all completely changed.
Maybe.
We'll never know.
Well, that's been a very a thoroughly enjoyable podcast. Thanks, Will.
Thanks you too, Sam.
Yeah, an excellent suggestion, and nice to take a trip down memory lane there as well. Thanks for joining us. Remember to subscribe and leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. If you enjoyed it, why don't you share the podcast with a friend? Hopefully they enjoy the pod as much as Lewis and George hopefully enjoy the new Black Bull racing car they'll get to drive this weekend. Where we go back to Italy, hooray!
You're gonna be so gutted if that car is terrible. You're next week's listen is gonna be such a depressing listen for you. You're gonna come on being such a depressive mood if that car is terrible.
I will be. I mean, I'm tempering my expectations a little bit. I don't think it's going to be sort of top of the grid. I'm just hoping it's a bit less. I don't know, unpliable. I don't want to see Lewis's like sad face on Sunday. That's what I really don't want to. I don't want to see
the sad radio as well.
Yeah, just like, thanks guys, let's keep pushing. And he's like, he's inside, he's dying inside. Fingers crossed. If you want to follow us at Twitter, we are at Lights Out Lads, and on Instagram we are at the Lights Out Pod. Will, here comes the spicy meatball. Maybe, hopefully, please let it be spicy. Formula One, please.
Yeah, let's hope with Imola this weekend. I apparently I don't know off the top of my head, but apparently the Grand Prix name has got like a ridiculously long name. It's like Formula One Bahrain Airways
Gran Premio. Yeah.
And apparently the official title, I saw this earlier, which is very good. The official title of the race is 64 letters or 63 letters. Which is the exact same number of letters in the title, which is the exact same number of laps in the race.
Wow, I love that. And George Russell's number, incidentally.
Yeah.
Maybe either 63 or 64. Maybe he's going to win it.
Yeah. But yeah, fingers crossed. And a fun thing I realised the other day, if you just ignore Formula One, if you just ignore Red Bull, if you act like they're in there, we're actually having a great season, the race for the first is really good. Aston Martin's only slightly ahead at the moment. That's what you got to view Formula One in this age. Just forget about Red Bull and just.
I'll do the same with the football as well, shall I? If you just ignore Manchester City, everyone's having a lovely time.
sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah. But yeah, thanks for listening. That's all from us. All the best and goodbye.
Bye.